Happy Sunday. Is it Sunday? I think it's Sunday. I'm losing track of the days. But we're back, and I'm going to read a little bit more. And today is chapter 24. So, away we go. Chapter 24. I skidded across the parquet dancing floor and thudded to a stop at Nate's side. My head spun. I'd been slung into Northwich Hall with the force of a trebuchet, and I collapsed on the ground, hands outstretched, terrified to look up. I had no idea what sort of reality I was in, but the world gelled and coagulated as the shapes around me grew defined. A knot of seething tendrils wrapped themselves around me in all directions. One squeezed my hand in desperation, probing for life, and I squeezed it back to show that I was still present, if breathless. My heart nearly burst, feeling both my happiness and his compounded. "Harry," said Emma. I glimpsed between the slithering tendrils, and my youngest sister stood before me, spattered in gore. Her face glowed. She looked like a woman who has walked a long way out of doors, fresh-faced and breathless, but happy with the zest of exercise. Emma held my hands as she guided me to my feet, and her fingers thrummed with power. Instantly I felt revived, as if I'd woken from a good long sleep. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I think so," I wheezed. But I wasn't, not really. My knees wobbled, and I crumpled back into Nate's embrace. This must be what it feels like, to be dragged backwards through a keyhole. The ballroom was in ruins. Broken glass glittered across the floor, peppered with the bashed remains and broken feathers of hundreds of starlings. The chandelier hung askew from its chain. The piano in the corner had collapsed. The portrait of elder Mr. Blackwood had sustained a gash along its side, though the man looked down upon us with the same poetic restlessness as before, and seemed wholly unconcerned with his superficial injury. Mary stood to the side of the piano, holding her head as if stunned, and Mr. Darling stood beside her, inquiring after her health. Her hands were red and burned, and her black hair had turned as white as a cloud. The two halves of the drab-green book lay at her feet, and they whimpered when she kicked them aside. Afraid, I looked around Emma to the remains of Mr. Marsh. She had dragged his halves together, set them alongside one another, and they lay in a pool of carnage, surrounded by the torn shreds of his uniform. But as I watched, the battered corpse twitched, then moved, then gave a gut-wrenching groan. The legs were bending, the arms were flexing. He tested each limb's worth as he drew himself slowly, painfully to his knees. Of course, his torn garments sloughed away as he rose, and to be honest, I saw more of his arbor vitae than good manners should allow, but I was too engrossed by the thick, ropey scar that orbited his naked body, from shoulder to hip, across chest and back, to notice the exposed privy features of his nether regions. Emma bent to him and caressed his face. The flush of good health traversed his pallid complexion from his neck to his toes until he, too, looked restored. "You have made me whole," he whispered in awe, his fingers playing across the scar, bisecting his chest. "I have," she replied, equally awed. Mr. Thorne's voice rang out from the corridor, and when I looked over, he was leaning heavily on Jane, holding the back of his head. "It was that wretched, meddlesome imbecile from the post office," he barked. "That senile old hag. She jumped me." "Mary read from the book," Jane said, and Thorne turned hard to Mary. "Well," he demanded, "are you whole?" She shook her head, her words coming out as a rasp. She touched her fingers to the center of her brow. "I don't know. I hope so. I only sang a song or two." She looked at me. "Harry was the one who tackled the frightful thing." "And from the looks of your dress," said Frederick, noting the blood, you pounded it into jelly." "What else could I do?" I said, as guilt welled up, and Nate held me close in support, with the warmth of affection rippling between us. "Mrs. Runkle was dismantling our existence. I had to bludgeon her." Thorne hobbled close, holding onto Jane's arm. "I can't tell you how many times I was tempted to do so myself, waiting an eternity for my change at the postal counter." Mary limped towards us, leaning on Frederick. "How did you know what to do?" "I saw the cane," I said. "Papa told me that Mr. Posey, all those years ago, defeated the demon with a silver mace. When Mrs. Posey read the book and was possessed, he bashed in her skull. It was the only thing I could think to do." Jane reached out to me. "What did you see on the other side?" But I only shook my head. It was a long time before I was able to confide in them, and tell them about the dry chemical smells or the fiery red rocks, the lizards or the ferocious plants, or worst of all, a vision of myself that had grown hard-hearted, scarred and sadistic, efficient at killing herself over and over again for all eternity. I hope never to look at myself in that way again. Nate took one half of the book, and I took the other, and together we tossed Songs of the Scented Garden down into the well where it belonged. He covered the wellhead over once more with the stone, then he locked the door and gave me the key to hang on my necklace for safekeeping. By the time we were finished, the others had retired outside to avoid the wreckage of the ballroom. We joined them on the front steps of Northwich Hall, sitting together and watching the birds swarm in the air, swooping and diving as if they no longer cared for souls or devils or foul beastly creatures. Where Marvin had fallen, there was only a mound of queer flowers, but they had withered and blackened, having fed of his corpse, and then died with the book that had seeded them. I stared for long minutes at that ugly patch of alien blossoms, and when Nate held my hand, I laid my head against his, and we shared a silent conversation of relief and astonishment and wordless wonder. No one seemed to pay any attention to Nate or his strange form. I suppose for Mr. Marsh and Mr. Darling, a gigantic benevolent terrestrial octopus was the least terrifying of all of our experiences since breakfast. An hour of silence and sunshine restored us. At last, in a soft rush of astonishment, Jane said, "Well, never have I seen anything so dramatic in all my life." "You'll get used to it," Thorne replied as he sat next to her, taking off his jacket and placing it on the top step. "I sincerely hope not," I replied, reeling on him in anger. "You have been lax in your care of a dangerous cargo, Mr. Thorne, and I will not have you place us all in such peril again." He cocked one eyebrow in my direction. "Do you think I'd be so irresponsible as to let any of those 3 books out of my sight?" "You already did," I pointed out, "and who can say what other horrible volumes you have on your shelves? History proves you to be a poor guardian for them." "You're overreacting, Harry," he dismissed, and he waved his hand in my general direction. "Your concern is completely unfounded. I don't need a musty old spinster to tell me my business." I was about to protest when I saw Jane move a little closer to Mr. Thorne. She looked at me, unimpressed, and then slipped her hand into his. "You have a bitter heart, sir," she said. "You have spent too long feeling grief and guilt, and it has soured you." Thorne's eyebrows arched. Then I saw a little flash of fear in those goggled eyes as he realized the danger of Jane's touch. He tried to withdraw his hand, but she would not let him. "I don't see into men's hearts as Harriet does," she replied, "but I can see enough to know that you are not happy, and you take out your ill ease on those around you. Yes, mistakes have been made, but I don't think you wish to put Dunham in danger again, do you?" "Of course not," he said mildly. "And I think you and I should have a little chat about the value of community, and how we might better serve our little town, and keep all within it safe from harm. Don't you agree?" "Oh, I do," he replied, showing all the self-determination of a puppet. Honestly, watching their conversation almost disturbed me to an equal degree as any other scene this morning. "Come then, sir, let us enjoy a walk together, you and I." She smiled sweetly. "Your library is of too great a value to leave in the hands of just one man alone, don't you think? I will endeavor to make you a more joyful person, more in keeping with the responsibility you must bear, and more pleasing to your neighbors, both in countenance and respectability." She set a light kiss upon his cheek. "And if all can be made right within your damaged psyche, I suspect that a gentleman in possession of such an important wealth of books and knowledge may well be in need of a wife." Together they rambled away, with Jane's hand on his forearm, and Aloysius's head in the clouds. Nate helped Mr. Marsh to his feet with 3 tentacles, and with another 2 he grabbed his half-brother's jacket and offered it with all the politeness to the naked soldier. Mr. Marsh took it with thanks, and once suitably covered, the recently deceased man found himself fairly tackled by an enthusiastic Emma. She gave a girlish squeal before peppering him with kisses. "Good Lord," I said to Mary, sitting beside me, "what a strange turn of events." We watched as Emma and Mr. Marsh pressed their foreheads together, drunk on their affection for one another, gazing into each other's eyes and ignoring the rest of us. "Well, Mary," I said, "shall we head home and see how Mamma and Papa weathered the weirdness?" Mary glanced at Frederick, and when she stood up, she gave me a coy smile. "I think I shall accompany Mr. Darling to assess the state of his household, and I shall take Emma with me to see if we might restore the rest of his family back to good health." She turned to our youngest sister and said, "Would you and Mr. Marsh care to join us?" "By all means," she replied, full of smiles. "I'm too happy to refuse anyone anything. I'll do whatever I can to lend a hand." Leaving Nate and I alone on the steps of Northwich Hall, the four of them began to stroll down the driveway in the direction of town, the sun and the trees conspiring to cast stripes across them. It was only then that I noticed, as they passed out of sight, that Mary and Frederick were holding hands. Thank you very much. That's chapter 24. Last chapter, chapter 25, coming up next.